5 of the 6-week journey, and
So
this
great.
week we are talking about maybe the most famous Old Testament character in the whole list of Hebrews chapter 11, and that is David. And there is a statement made about David that has become very popularized, very well known amongst Jesus followers and even just people who are aware of Christianity. And it says this about David in 1 Samuel 13:14, that after King Saul, the king of Israel, God sought for himself a man after his own heart, and he found and chose David. This man by the name of David is known now as the man after God's own heart.
And then it's reiterated in Acts chapter 13 that David was a man after God's own heart. So God looked for a man, found a man,
Yeah.
and then David continued to be that man his whole life. And I love reading about the life of David, who was king of Israel. So imagine the responsibilities, the weight, and his journey to become king was obviously significant as well. But David, here he was king. He just had a trust, even as the leader, that, hey, I'm actually not the leader. God is the leader of my life and of this country. And so whatever happens, ultimately, it's up to God. And as we look at the life of David, there's this phrase that happens over and over again. It says that David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered. In other words, David, being a man after God's own heart, had this relationship with God that was so real. It was so everyday. David just didn't inquire about God about spiritual things. He inquired about battles and his king and the kingdom and how he was going to function as the leader. And he had this real, vibrant relationship with God.
And I love that. And I think what's amazing, even while we're sitting here talking about David, is what you take away from David's life and what I take away from David's life. There's obviously very, very similar, but even different. I think of the title, A Man After God's Own Heart. And I think one of the indicators is David was a man who inquired of the Lord. He was a man who was always talking to
That's
God.
awesome.
You could say he was a man of prayer. And David did want to do what's right. But where I can relate to David is David didn't always do what he wanted to do. He didn't always do the right that
Yeah.
he truly desired to do.
Yeah.
You could argue, out of all the characters we're studying in 6-week journey, David has the ultimate roller coaster life. We know he's passionate. We know he's a musician. We know he's a creative. He's an artist. And he has kind of that emotional roller coaster that sometimes artists and musicians can have.
And preachers.
Thanks for that one.
no problem.
But he has high highs, and then he has low lows. And in some cases, they're really close together. And so I think of a week like this, leading up to week 5 here at the 6-week journey. Boy, I can relate to David, and maybe you're watching this right now going, a man after God's own heart, a woman after God's own heart. I could never have that title.
He must have been perfect. He must have done everything right.
Pristine record, right?
Felt peace all the time.
Yeah, but that's the exact opposite oftentimes of where we find David in Scripture.
Yeah.
David, for instance, was an adulterer. David was a murderer. David was a liar. I mean, we could go on and on
He complained about God. God, why are all the bad people getting
Big
the
complainer.
good stuff and I'm not getting anything? I mean, he was raw.
Yeah, David was jealous. David was competitive. He would compare himself. David was very desirous for material things at times. His track record, when you look at it, you're like, well, if he can be a man after God's own heart, if he can be a person who has a heart like God's, well, then I think we all qualify to be a person after God's own heart. And of course, Acts chapter 13, which I want to read, it says this, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. And I remember reading that thinking, but he won't do everything you want him to do. But I think the message is, of course, David's trust and reliance in God would always bring him around and bring him back to God's plan and fulfilling God's purpose in his life. And that's the redemptive story of David. Because if we all put our faith in Jesus, even when we deviate, and we will, God is always faithful. Because of Jesus, because of God's goodness, he brings us back to his perfect plan for our life.
And his reliance in God wasn't just ambiguous, like, oh, God, I trust you. He had trust that when he made the biggest mistake of his life, which was adultery and murder, he had faith that God forgave him. In fact, he says in the Psalm, God, cleanse me and I will be cleansed.
That's right.
I love that statement. It was even before Jesus. And maybe today you find yourself struggling with forgiveness. struggling with shame, thinking, how can I ever be over this, what I have done or who I am? Can you just grab that hold of that statement and make it yours? God, forgive me and I will be clean. That's the heart of Jesus for you that he wants you to live with today.